Hi, I'm Josh Underwood, and this is a recording for Kate Borthwick at the University of Southampton, who has kindly asked me to talk about why I'm using voice-driven artificially intelligent language assistants in AFL classes, and what I'm doing, how I'm exploring the use of these devices. So, I guess before I explain why, I'll just make it clear what I'm talking about. I'm talking about things like the Google Home Assistant. Hey Google, what's the time?
It's 5:26.
Thank you. And Alexa, what's the weather like in Brighton?
Right now in Brighton, it's 14 degrees Celsius with intermittent clouds.
Thank you. Okay, but I'm also talking about things like voice search. And the reason why I'm interested in these kinds of technologies is because I believe that using voice-driven artificial intelligence assistants in class can provide more of my students with more opportunities to speak that are more meaningful and more fun. But just to clarify on that, I'm talking mainly about semi-controlled or controlled speaking practice, not free speaking to AI agents. And my context is mainly monolingual primary and secondary age EFL classes, where it is definitely a concern that we try to get students to do project work and group work and communicative activities in the target language, in this case English, but for them to speak English to each other is not necessarily particularly meaningful, or it's difficult to train them to do that. So talking to AIs that respond to them can give them a purpose, a meaningful reason to speak because the AI does stuff for them. For example, if I say, Alexa, play some music for me.
Here's a station you might like, the Rolling Stones, from Amazon Music.
Thank you. Alexa, stop the music. We get some kind of response to what we say, so that makes it in some way more meaningful than other forms of controlled practice, to my mind. Anyway, so it's important to bear in mind that my context is monolingual primary secondary classes, and that the reason that I'm trying to use these technologies is because I think they provide a motivating and, at a certain extent, meaningful reason to practice speaking. On returning to primary EFL teaching in 2016, I hadn't been teaching primary level for quite some time, and I was overwhelmed by the number of questions students had for me, particularly during project work. And I thought, well, maybe many of those questions might be quicker and better answered by AI assistants. Things like, how do you spell some word, or how do you say something in English, or how heavy is an elephant, for example, questions that they might have during project work. So if I got them to use AI assistants to do this, they would be practicing speaking, they would have a reason for speaking English, and it would give me more time to speak to them individually in more meaningful ways rather than running around trying to attend to lots of questions at the same time. So I've been using these kinds of technologies, and I still feel that they are motivating lots of speaking practice in my class. But I'll move on to talk on a little bit about the kinds of things I'm doing in my class now. But before I do that, I should say a little bit about who I am. I'm a teacher and a teacher trainer at the British Council in Bilbao, but I also have a bit of a background in educational technology design and research, and I worked for 10 or more years for the University of Sussex and the Institute of Education in educational research projects. I co-authored a review about potential uses of AI in education, review of research in that area, which has been going on for a long time, which was kindly mentioned in a recent report from Pearson about arguing for the use of AI in education. So I have kind of a teaching and a research background, and an interest in technology and artificial intelligence. So what kinds of activities am I talking about? Well, I think one of the places where I started, apart from, as I've said previously, the idea that I could get the students in my primary classes to use assistants, language assistants, intelligent language assistants to help them do project work and drive them to speak more English. Was earlier than that, I had noticed that speech recognition had got so good that it was now possible to give students some kind of meaningful feedback on pronunciation, for example. So I've been doing this with adult classes for quite some time. Things like saying, show me a picture of a sheep.
Pictures of a sheep. Here you go.
Or show me a picture of a ship.
A ship. Here you are.
Okay, so this is meaningful feedback, to my mind, on pronunciation of ship and sheep, for example, which are typically difficult for Spanish students. And you can try getting similar results for all kinds of different pronunciation activities. So that's one reason that I might use it in class or started using it in class. But like I say, with primary, what I was doing initially was more like using voice to find specified information. So turning worksheets that you might use for web quests into spoken activities. And I think after using and demonstrating some of the things I was doing in teacher training sessions, I had some primary teachers coming back to me saying that it worked very well for them to get students to remove the keyboards in their computer labs and get students to use voice to help them do web quests, written web quests, but speaking the answers in. So they were pleased with the way that was working. And I feel in my primary classes, it was also motivating to some extent, more practice and more speaking, and the students fighting with each other to let me speak to the thing that wanting to try and get these devices to respond to them. So I've already demonstrated how we might use spoken instructions to assistance to practice pronunciation, but also to help us make visual associations with vocabulary. For example, maybe I don't know what an artichoke is, so I might say, show me a picture of an artichoke. And this will
All right, pictures for an artichoke.
To understand what an artichoke is and perhaps make some associations with this vocabulary. But like I was saying, mainly I was using voice initially, or motivated to use voice to help students do project work in primary. So they were more typically trying to find out information to help them do projects. For example, I might ask them to do a project on the solar system, and they might be asking things like, Alexa, how hot is Mars?
The surface temperature of Mars is minus 65 degrees Celsius.
And maybe they were trying to find out which is the hottest planet or the coldest planet. So they could do controlled practice of questions using superlatives, for example. And we'd move on to, Alexa, who's the fastest woman in the world?
The fastest woman is Shelley Ann Fraser-Price.
Anyway, and here you can see how with virtual reality environments, you might say, play dead, run. And you can see how the dog in that case responds to our voice. So you might imagine directions and moving through virtual environments. In fact, if you look at Google experiments, you'll find things for moving through Street View, panoramas, etc. So to go back to where I was, basically, I'm using voice recognition or speech recognition coupled with AI assistants to motivate speaking. There's lots of different things you might use it for and ways you can use it. And I think it's a question of designing activities that exploit this ability to kind of motivate controlled practice. And of course, there's other things you can do. I mean, it's important to start thinking about the advantages and dangers of living with these very fast developing technologies. So other things that I get students to do is explore what any AI is capable of, get them in working groups to think of questions to try and then take turns to try those questions with the different assistants. And of course, this is good question formation practice, but it also helps them to think about artificial intelligence. And then we start moving on to things like, if I say, hey, Google, what's my name?
Your name is Joshua.
Okay, so then we might start talking about whether it's a good idea to tell these kinds of AIs that are capable of recognizing voices who we are. What are the implications for data protection, but also what are the implications for future living and living with artificial intelligences? So you can lead into kind of life skills for the future. But now I'll skip on to something else that's important, which is common issues or problems working with these kinds of technologies. Obviously, things are changing very rapidly, so by the time you see this, maybe a lot of these things will have changed. But I think when I've been using things like Siri or Google Search with voice on iPads or on computers, it can misunderstand you and return very strange results, including strange images. So I think it's important to make sure that safe search is on if you're using these with children and with adults, perhaps. Clearly, voice recognition is much, much better than it used to be. Speech recognition is much better than it used to be, but it works poorly with lots of voice talking at the same time. So this is an opportunity to get students to practice working on turn taking, and it's important that they do take turns. Otherwise, they get worse results. Some kinds of questions don't usually work very well. So, things like saying, what's faster, a cheetah or a dolphin, wouldn't usually get a good answer. And students need to learn and think about how they can get the answers they want. So they might need to say, how fast is a cheetah? How fast is a dolphin? In order to answer the questions they want to do. Break up their questions, make them manageable. Like I think I've mentioned, dialogues don't work particularly well. I would say that if you're using these in class with groups, you need to monitor carefully. So it hasn't necessarily solved the issue of me having too much to do in my primary classes, although I think it has resulted in my primary children, certainly, and secondary students, producing more speech motivated by trying to communicate with these devices, and particularly kind of controlled practice of structures that I, as a teacher, am enthusiastic about and think can help for me deliver, as I said earlier on, potentially more opportunities, more motivating, meaningful, fun opportunities for more of my students to speak, particularly in the kind of context in which I'm generally working, which is in monolingual classes. So there will be some references to some useful related reading, but obviously those change very quickly, and I'll include those with notes to go with this video. Thank you for listening to me for so long. Bye.